Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, July 25th, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about Joe Biden's electability and how him running for re-election puts him in a much better position than the mainstream media, the polling numbers, and the rest of the mainstream political pundits seem to indicate with this upcoming election in just around a year. Now, heading into the primary season, there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, RFK Jr., right, these names are going to be their respective nominees. And we can pretty much assume on the Democratic side that Joe Biden is very much on track to win the nomination. There hasn't been any major primary contesting here, and the Democrats have unified around him from all members of all sides of the aisle, regardless of where you are in the party. That's good news for Joe Biden at point number one. But what we find on the Republican side is that there's a bit more uncertainty as to who the nominee is going to be. A lot of people do believe that Donald Trump is going to be the nominee, but there's also a considerable portion of the nation that doesn't necessarily believe that Donald Trump would be renominated and isn't exactly as, how I should put this, more in touch with how the polls and the fundraising numbers and the endorsements actually match up. It's really undeniable that Donald Trump has a very strong lead across the Republican primary as of now. He leads by 34 points nationwide and is very much on track to head into the Iowa caucus with about a 20 to 30 point advantage based off the current numbers that we are polling from a number of reputable pollsters. Now, polls aren't everything, but generally speaking, we have never seen a candidate come into an open primary race with such a strong advantage in recent electoral history. In fact, many of the primary victories in 2008 and 2012 were contentious up until the final end. You also saw that on the Republican side, there were comeback bids. For instance, John McCain in 2008 didn't start out strong at all, lost in Iowa cataclysmically, but then had a reboot in New Hampshire and was on track to win the nomination from there on out. The bad news is, for all of the other candidates that aren't Donald Trump, is that Donald Trump continues to lead in all of the 4 major states and every single state following. There is literally not one state where Ron DeSantis leads Donald Trump, with the exception of 2 outlier polls in Tennessee and Wisconsin. Beyond that, amongst the hundreds of polls that have been taken, Donald Trump consistently maintains a lead, and as of recently has led nationwide by 40 points, 44 points, and 43 points over his next second-place candidate, which is Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, we're talking a lot about the Republicans, but what does this have to do with President Biden? Well, practically everything. You see, the current polling numbers for President Biden and President Trump aren't exactly the best for the Democratic Party. They're not in a better position than where they were back in 2020, and they're certainly not as strong as Democrats would hope as of today. Now, Joe Biden doesn't need to win all of the states he won in 2020. He could reasonably lose Georgia, Arizona, even Michigan, and still have the 270 electoral votes needed to win. It's not to say that he would want to do that or that would be beneficial in any way, but it is more so to say that Joe Biden does have some room to fall, though not that much. But not enough room that you would see a Biden plus 0.1% lead give any type of confidence to the Democratic Party. So where does the title of this video come from? Where does this confidence in President Biden come from? Namely the 2022 midterm elections. Allow me to explain. Looking back at the 2022 midterm elections, the Democratic Party wasn't on track for victory the night of the Senate, House, gubernatorial elections. A lot of the numbers looked very grim. Regardless of the state that you looked at, Republicans were leading in the polls. For instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, we can see here that Dr. Oz led by 0.4. In Nevada, Adam Laxalt led by 3. Blake Masters led in Arizona by 0.3. Raphael Warnock was losing to Herschel Walker by 1.4% in Georgia. Ohio was going to J.D. Vance by 8 points. Wisconsin was going to Ron Johnson by 4 points. Practically everywhere you looked, the Democratic Party was losing in these polls. And ultimately, the polls were wrong. Nevada went blue, Arizona went blue, Georgia went blue, Pennsylvania went blue. The majority of the states that I just mentioned went in a different direction. And for the first time since the 2016 election, the polls actually underestimated the Democratic Party. And I think there had to be a common denominator here, but I first wanted to explore the governor elections, and we found the same exact thing. Wisconsin had the Republicans up in statewide polling. Arizona had Carrie Lake up by 4 points in statewide polling, right? You found that even in some of the states that Democrats knew they were on track to win, where Democrats did have a lead, for instance, in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro was only up by 8 points. For reference, he won by 15. You can see that all across this map here, Kansas too, Derek Schmidt, actually the polls were in Laura Kelly's favorite, but the adjusted ones, and the reason why this RCP projection might show slightly different results, is because they adjusted based off of historical inaccuracies that benefited the Democratic Party in terms of the overestimation and the days leading into Election Day. They adjusted based off the incorrectness from 2016, 2018, 2020, and they found that Democrats were on track to lose many seats, many governorships, many House races. Yet ultimately, Democrats won in Kansas. They won in Arizona. They won in Wisconsin. They won in Michigan, and the trend continues. So this common denominator came around President Donald Trump, someone who had propped up all of these failed candidates. I mean, quite literally 95% of them were handpicked by him to win the nomination, and they did, and they lost the general election to these Democrats who in some cases weren't awe-inspiring, weren't doing so well in the preliminary election data. I think we are looking at something very similar happening with President Joe Biden ahead of his re-election bid. The majority of the country doesn't want a Donald Trump-Joe Biden rematch, but we already know how they voted when presented with these two options in the past. Yes, things could be different, and yes, Joe Biden is unpopular today. But I do not believe the average American does believe that the Biden-Trump rematch is likely. And with that lack of sense of urgency on both sides of the aisle, you find that a significant portion of the American public, which you know is just simply very much does have their minds made up, in this 2024 data doesn't have a decision. There is no way in our reality, our present state of being, that over 12% of the country is undecided in this Trump v. Biden rematch. It's more so that a lot of them refuse to accept this as reality because it doesn't seem likely. And, you have never seen in the past 100 years, I think 1928 was the last time this happened, you have never seen a former president become the nominee the next election cycle and run against the candidate they lost to. It has only happened once in American history and never again. It's not a widely accepted notion. It is not a widely accepted phenomenon. This is just something that is foreign, lost on the American public. And I do believe that leads this high level of uncertainty. Now, I don't deny that Joe Biden has lost voters since 2020, but I also don't believe that Donald Trump has gained that many more. I, in fact, think that Donald Trump today, if the election was held, would lose to Joe Biden by a larger margin than he did in 2020. That's not just based off of my, simple vibes or however I'm trying to argue it. That is based off the data from 2022 and special election data since then that shows that candidates closely aligned with the former president typically are on track to lose their races, typically are on track to lose in the close and competitive districts. And I think the Democratic Party recognizes that. That's why they're propping up Donald Trump so much and why they don't have this robust campaign effort that the $70 million that they raised between Joe Biden's announcement in mid-April and the end of June, why that $72 million hasn't been spent in the way that you might see a campaign be spent in a Republican primary or see a campaign be spent in a Democratic primary. The money being raised for Joe Biden's campaign is going on a back burner. It's staying in this war chest that they can unleash against an eventual nominee who Democrats in many ways, again, are hoping is Donald Trump. They know that he is their best chance at winning re-election, which is why the Biden campaign has only 10 staffers. And you think about that, 10 staffers, if you don't really, know electoral politics that well, that's nothing. It is quite literally, as best put by the mainstream media, a basement campaign at this point where they are just dwelling in the darkness because they are waiting for the opportunity to unveil themselves. They just announced their headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware, not necessarily the biggest, swing state move. Delaware is Joe Biden's home state. Democrats are in some cases worried, but a lot of the people who are seeing this behind the scenes, including anyone who's looking at it from a pundit standpoint, is that they are widely expecting Donald Trump to be the nominee, which leads us into this idea that there will be a better election for Joe Biden because that's exactly how it's going to happen. Ron DeSantis, for reference, just fired 38 campaign staffers after he had to go ahead and slash about a third of his funding for his campaign staff. Got a third of all of his staffers gone and fired from the campaign. 38 staffers. Joe Biden, for reference, has 10, and Ron DeSantis is in second place. So back to the point about Joe Biden, with a lot of Americans uncertain as to who's going to be the nominee on the Republican side, some Americans uncertain as to who's going to be on the Democratic side, they aren't really faced with this reality that we are in fact in for a rematch. I'm still coming to terms with it, even though we probably have seen this coming since November 8th, 2020, when Donald Trump lost the election officially according to the mainstream media, or technically November 7th, but that was the day after. But this Trump v. Biden rematch is very much going to happen. And I think that Joe Biden, though he has lost support, only needs to be outpacing one person, and that is Donald Trump. The one benefit that Joe Biden has running against Donald Trump is that this is not some type of new, random candidate who could really take down the, Biden machine here, the strong electoral juggernaut that he is, and Donald Trump is in many ways in some regions of the United States. He's running against a candidate who he has beat before. And the American public, when faced with the opportunity to vote between the lesser of two evils, they are going to choose the lesser of two evils. And while Joe Biden may be unpopular, it helps to have somebody slightly more unpopular. Donald Trump currently stands at negative 18 points nationwide, Joe Biden at negative 15. Negligible in certain comparisons, but when it comes down to how voters actually vote, they will probably opt for Joe Biden, as they did in 2020, over Donald Trump in the 2024 election. And we also have to remember that the 2022 midterm showed us that polls don't always capture Democratic sentiment correctly. And the Democratic Party can drive out independent and left-leaning voters when it comes down to a Trump-style candidate on the ballot. Even if they aren't as enthusiastic in polls, even if they aren't answering in a way to pundits and surveys and whatever it might be, in a way that is truly indicative of how they're going to vote, the real poll that matters is Election Day. And when you see a state like Arizona, for instance, that had the Republicans ahead by 4 points in the polls because Katie Hobbs had practically ran a non-existent campaign, with Kari Lake being so far in the lead for a state that voted for Joe Biden, for all of a sudden the Democrat to swoop in was a testament that Kari Lake's overindulgence in alt-right politics lost her the election. Her close association with a candidate who has lost Arizona before lost her the election. There were candidates on the ballot, for instance, I think most notably Brian Kemp in Georgia, who distanced himself away from Donald Trump well enough that he was able to win in a state that Joe Biden won, that on the same ballot the Democrats won, Raphael Warnock won the runoff election. Brian Kemp won by 8 points. A Republican governor won by 8 points on the same ballot that the majority of voters eventually opted for the Democrat, and the plurality opted for the Democrat on the same exact ticket. There were Warnock-Kemp voters. The same way there will be voters that turn out in favor of Joe Biden, even if they aren't declaring so right now. 2022 was a shock because Republicans were expecting things not to matter because of how unpopular Joe Biden was. But if anything, that was also a testament to how unpopularity for Joe Biden doesn't hinder Democrats the way it did under Obama, doesn't hinder Democrats the way it did under Clinton, the way that Trump hindered Republicans in 2018, the way Bush hindered Republicans in 2006. It was an anomaly election, and I don't deny that abortion and gay rights played a major factor, but they will also play a factor a year, 2 years later. These aren't some lost issues that Democrats are never going to bring up again, nor will they have the majority of the country on their side again. That's exactly how it's going to go. We are seeing a repeat of the 2018 midterms, where Donald Trump's influence lost Republicans the election. A 2020 repeat, where Democrats or Republicans, with their association with Donald Trump, many of them lost their seats, lost their races. Donald Trump himself lost the White House. Then came 2022, same exact story. Joe Biden here provides that level of, centrism and normalcy that voters have known for the past 3 years, that they voted for in 2020, and he is a tried and tested, vetted candidate, 1988, 2008, 2020. I mean, this guy has all of his stuff laid out there, and he's been able to win. There is nothing, it seems, that is taking down Joe Biden tremendously, and though the polls might show a close and competitive race between them, I remind you that they did for Democrats in 2022. And I'm not trying to deny the reality of polls, but I do not believe that the American public really sees the race as it is right now. Because on the outside, it doesn't seem feasible. It doesn't seem reality that we are truly in for a rematch when the American public didn't even want the initial matchup back in 2020 by an overwhelming margin, right? That's where we're working with. But Joe Biden as a candidate has already proven he could flip a state such as Georgia for the first time since 92 to the Democratic Party, that he could flip Arizona for the first time since 96, that he could win back the blue wall. This was the case he was making to the American public. He was making specifically to Democrats in the primary, that he was going to take this Midwestern strategy, this Sun Belt strategy, and win, that he was going to do what many of the other Democrats he thought were not going to be able to. And I am telling you now, with this all but assured renomination of Joe Biden to the Democratic side, all but assured renomination of Donald Trump to the Republican side, we are in for a very similarly looking electoral map. And though the polls might show Joe Biden down by or up by just a point today, I can guarantee you his margin in 2024 will be larger than it was in 2020. It will just take time for the public and voters to recognize that we are in this, in their eyes, lesser of two evil situation, and the American public does narrowly prefer one candidate over the other, and has proven in electoral history that they very much do in Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and potentially more states as we head into the next election and count the ballots and start to see flips from red to blue, flips from blue to red. It will be fascinating to watch the 2024 election unfold because all of these candidates have all of their business laid out. The attacks that will be made will be against their own administrations about why they don't deserve to be reelected, or I guess it's still a technical term for reelection for Donald Trump. All of these arguments are going to be made, and we will see what happens. As of today, I again would bet that Joe Biden does better in 2024 than he did in 2020. Times can change. Elections can change. American politics changes overnight in some cases. But there's one thing that I think we are severely underestimating as a punditry space, as a news space, as a collective, and that is Joe Biden's electability, especially against candidates like Donald Trump. And when I say like Donald Trump, I mean Ron DeSantis, right? I mean Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean candidates that are cut from the same cloth that would perform probably just as poorly as former President Trump, that would probably lose to Joe Biden given the nature of Joe Biden's recent electoral history, his expansiveness, and the state of the country today. Joe Biden benefits by being slightly less unlikable than Donald Trump, as Donald Trump benefited by being slightly less unlikable than Hillary Clinton. It's not a perfect science. That's just one point of reference amongst many others that lead me to my ultimate conclusion about Biden's overperformance, Biden's, assurance in this election, his electability for re-election. But there's a lot to unpack here, and hopefully I've discussed some of the main topics that you can take away from this and understand why I believe Joe Biden is an underestimated candidate for the 2024 presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.